Right now, as you're watching this, the United States military has placed a blockade on Iranian ports in the Persian Gulf, the first naval blockade of a major oil-producing nation since World War II. 6 weeks of war just ended. Thousands of missiles were fired. American bombs hit Iranian nuclear facilities. And Iran's nuclear program, the one the United States has spent 70 years trying to stop, is still standing. Not slowed, still standing. And here's what nobody is telling you. The West didn't just fail to stop it. They funded it. They trained the scientists. They helped build the infrastructure. This is the story of how that happened and why everything the United States has tried, from diplomacy to sanctions to assassination to full military strikes, has failed to stop it. Let's get into it. To understand where we are today, you have to go back to 1953, because that's where the chain begins. During World War II, the Anglo-Soviet invasion of Iran forced the abdication of Reza Shah and put his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, on the throne. In 1951, Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh nationalized Iran's British-owned oil industry. That single decision set off a crisis that would shape the next 70 years. Back in 1953, the CIA and MI6 backed a coup that overthrew Mossadegh, a democratically elected leader, and reinstated the Shah. The reason was oil. British companies had lost access to Iranian production. They wanted it back. Britain imposed sweeping economic sanctions, prohibiting the export of key commodities, making it impossible to sell Iranian oil internationally. Iranians were becoming poorer and unhappier by the day. The Shah, isolated and economically strangled, entered into negotiations. The result was the Consortium Agreement of 1954. 50% of Iran's oil handed to Western companies. 40% to 5 American firms, Standard Oil, Saucony, Vacuum, Gulf Oil, and the Texas Company. British Iranian interests took another 40%. A Dutch company, 14%. A French company, 6%. The model was borrowed directly from the Aramco deal Saudi Arabia signed in 1950. Same structure applied to Iran's resources. But the Shah inserted one condition the West underestimated. The deal expired in 1979. And when the consortium exercised its option to extend 3 times, 5 years each, the Shah refused, every single time, because he was building something they couldn't own. In 1963, Mohammad Reza Shah launched the White Revolution, nationalized industries, land redistribution, infrastructure on scale Iran had never seen, manufacturing of cars, appliances, goods, a new industrial class insulated from foreign competition, nuclear facilities. The goal, build an Iran that didn't need the consortium. By 1973, the National Iranian Oil Company renegotiated the consortium's terms entirely, eventually taking full control of the industry. By 1979, the deal would have expired regardless of anything else. But in 1957, right in the middle of this transformation, the United States handed Iran something far more consequential than oil rights. President Eisenhower stood before the United Nations and proposed Atoms for Peace. The idea: spread civilian nuclear technology worldwide under international supervision. Create an agency, what would later become the IAEA, to manage nuclear materials. Give countries a peaceful path to nuclear energy and they have less reason to build a bomb. It laid the groundwork for the 1968 Non-Proliferation Treaty. The grand bargain: non-nuclear states get access to peaceful nuclear technology. In exchange, they renounce weapons. Iran is one of the first countries to sign up. So it was, in fact, the U.S. that helped build Iran's first research reactor, trained Iranian scientists at American universities, supported construction of the Bushehr nuclear power plant. Sound familiar? Then 1979 happened, and everything the Shah had built came apart in under a year. Mohammad Reza Shah left Iran for exile in January of 1979. He would rather leave than order his military to fire on his own people. Estimates of the death toll from the Islamic Revolution range from 540 to over 2,000 people. The Islamic government itself claimed 60,000. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini became supreme leader. The Shah died in exile in Egypt, where Anwar Sadat had granted him asylum. The new government abandoned the nuclear program almost immediately. It called nuclear energy un-Islamic. Foreign workers fled. The Bashar reactor, half built, was left to rust. And then, in September of 1980, Iraq invaded. The Iran-Iraq War lasted 8 years. Saddam Hussein's government had 3 objectives: prevent Khomeini from exporting Iran's Shia revolution into Iraq, protect Iraq's regional dominance, replace Iran as the primary power in the Persian Gulf. Iraq was not fighting alone. The United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, France, Italy, and most Arab nations supported Iraq. Iranian airstrikes targeted the Bashar reactors directly. Infrastructure built over decades was destroyed in months. Then Iraq used chemical weapons against its own Kurdish population, against Iranian forces on the front lines. Thousands died. The international community issued statements, and almost nothing else. Iran was watching. A country being invaded by a neighbor backed by almost every major world power, being gassed while the world looked away. Drawing conclusions. By 1987, Iran had opened a second front. It began mining international shipping lanes in the Persian Gulf. And I want to be precise here, because this is almost always reported as Iranian aggression without context. Based on declassified intelligence and historical analysis, it was calculated strategy with 3 specific objectives. First, cripple Iraq's economy. Iraq was exporting oil through the Gulf to finance the war. Stop the tankers, stop the revenue. Second, force the United States to leave the region. The U.S. had launched Operation Earnest Will, escorting Kuwaiti oil tankers sailing under American flags. A declassified CIA document from April 1988 noted Iranian strategists believed inflicting U.S. casualties would create what they called, and I'm quoting directly, a quagmire effect, forcing an American withdrawal. The ghost of Vietnam was very much in the room. Third, asymmetric warfare. Iran's Navy couldn't match the U.S. Navy conventionally, but a mine costing a few $1,000s could cripple a multi-million-dollar warship, spike insurance rates, and create the appearance of control over waters Iran couldn't dominate any other way. The strategy backfired. On April 14, 1988, at 4:45 in the afternoon, the guided missile frigate USS Samuel B. Roberts, operating in international waters, struck an Iranian M08 naval mine. The explosion blew a 15 to 21-foot hole in the hull, broke the ship's keel, 10 crew members were injured. The ship came within minutes of sinking. Navy divers recovered additional mines from the water. Their serial numbers matched mines previously seized from an Iranian vessel caught laying mines the previous September. President Reagan stated, and I'm quoting directly, "No doubt exists that Iran laid these mines for the specific purpose of damaging or sinking U.S. or other non-belligerent ships." 4 days later, the U.S. responded. Operation Praying Mantis, April 18, 1988, the largest American naval surface engagement since World War II. U.S. forces destroyed Sasan and Siri oil platforms, which intelligence indicated were being used as command and control bases. When Iranian naval forces engaged, the missile boat Joshan was sunk. The frigate Sahand was sunk. The frigate Sabalan was crippled and left dead in the water. Iran didn't retaliate. It couldn't. 3 months later, Iran accepted the UN ceasefire under Security Council Resolution 598. No border changes, no reparations, 8 years of war, nothing to show for it. And here's the lesson Iran took. Not just from Praying Mantis, but the entire war. Iraq had used chemical weapons. The world said almost nothing. Iran had tried to change the strategic balance with mines, and the United States destroyed most of its navy in a single day. Without the backing of any major power, Iran had been beaten on every front. The only countries in the world that don't face that problem are the ones with weapons that make the cost of invasion unthinkable. Iran drew that lesson in ink. By the mid-1980s, before the war had even ended, Iran had already begun secretly rebuilding its nuclear program. And in 1987, an offer arrived. The AQ Khan Network, Pakistan's black market nuclear operation, run by the man who built Pakistan's own bomb, offered Iran centrifuge blueprints, the machines used to enrich uranium. Iran accepted. Through channels crossing multiple countries and jurisdictions, materials and designs changed hands. Between 1999 and 2003, a covert Iranian program called AMAD took shape. On January 31st, 2018, Israeli Mossad agents infiltrated a warehouse in southern Tehran and removed 100,000 documents, paper records, and computer files detailing Ahmad's work over those 4 years. On April 30th, Prime Minister Netanyahu presented the trove publicly. According to the documents, Ahmad's goal was to design, produce, and test 5 nuclear warheads, each with a 10-kiloton yield, integrated on a ballistic missile. Iranian Foreign Minister Zarif called it a rehash of old allegations. But David Albright of the Institute for Science and International Security drew a different conclusion. And I'm quoting directly. The archive indicated that Iran's weapons program was more advanced than previously believed in the West. Should Iran pull out of the nuclear agreement, it would be able to produce weapons, quote, swiftly, possibly within a few months. Now here's where it gets uncomfortable. Whether or not Ahmad was fully operational, the knowledge existed. The centrifuge designs, the enrichment calculations, the implosion geometries, you can destroy a building. You cannot unteach a physicist. August of 2002, an Iranian opposition group publicly revealed 2 secret nuclear facilities, Natanz, an enrichment site, and Arak, a heavy water reactor. The IAEA confirmed that Iran had violated the very safeguards agreement that had given it access to civilian nuclear technology in the first place. Under international pressure, Iran voluntarily suspended enrichment between 2003 and 2005. Then, Mohammad Ahmadinejad was elected. Enrichment resumed, UN sanctions followed. In 2010, a cyber weapon called Stuxnet, jointly developed by the United States and Israel, infected Iranian centrifuges and caused them to physically destroy themselves. The first known use of a cyber weapon to cause physical destruction of critical infrastructure. And it set Iran's nuclear program back by roughly 2 years. 2 years. That's what the most sophisticated cyber attack in history bought. Then came the deal. In 2015, after years of negotiations involving the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Russia, and China, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action was signed. Iran agreed to reduce its enriched uranium stockpile by 98%, cap enrichment at 3.67% purity, dismantle 2/3 of its centrifuges, accept daily IAEA inspections. In exchange, sanctions relief worth over $100 billion in unfrozen assets. It was the most intrusive nuclear monitoring regime ever imposed on a non-weapon state. Most analysts assessed it would extend Iran's breakout time, the time needed to produce enough fissile material for a bomb, from a few months to at least a year. Iran complied for 3 years. On May 8, 2018, President Trump withdrew the United States from the JCPOA. He called it a horrible, one-sided deal. He launched what his administration called a maximum pressure campaign, reimposing every sanction that had been lifted and adding new ones. The goal? Force Iran back to the table for a better deal. Iran's response was to accelerate enrichment. Within a year, it was enriching above JCPOA limits. Within 2 years, it had produced enough enriched uranium for multiple weapons. Not a weapon, the hardware, but the material. And then came January 3, 2020. At Baghdad International Airport, a U.S. drone strike General Qassem Soleimani, the commander of Iran's Quds Force, the elite unit responsible for Iran's covert military operations across the Middle East. The strike also killed Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, the deputy commander of Iran-backed militias in Iraq. Soleimani was arguably the second most powerful figure in Iran. He had directed operations in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and Yemen for over 2 decades. Iran's response was carefully calibrated. 5 days later, it launched over a dozen ballistic missiles at 2 Iraqi military bases housing American troops. No Americans were killed, a number later revised to 109 suffering traumatic brain injuries. Iran had demonstrated it could hit U.S. positions with precision, while deliberately stopping short of casualties that would trigger a full American military response. The message was clear. We can reach you, don't push us further. And then Iran announced it would no longer be bound by any limits of the JCPOA. Now here's the question nobody in the history books bothers to ask. If the assassination of Iran's second most powerful military figure didn't stop or even slow the nuclear program, what exactly was the end game? In January 2025, Donald Trump returned to the White House. He relaunched maximum pressure, tightened the sanctions that had tightened before, and sent his envoy, Steve Witkoff, to begin indirect nuclear talks with Iran and Oman. Now here's where it gets uncomfortable, because these talks were unlike any the United States had conducted before. The Obama administration had sent 10 senior officials from 4 different departments to nuclear talks in Vienna. They worked around the clock for days. They were in constant contact with Washington. Witkoff, according to The Guardian, rarely took notes. He brought with him a political essayist who, by his own admission, had no specialist background in the Iran nuclear file. In one interview, Witkoff referred to the Strait of Hormuz as the Gulf of Hormuz. When talks resumed in Oman in February of 2026, Witkoff arrived with the commander of U.S. forces in the Middle East in full naval uniform. He was politely asked to leave by the Omani host. A Gulf diplomat with direct knowledge of the talks described the negotiating team as, and I'm quoting directly, Israeli assets that had conspired to force the U.S. president into entering a war from which he is now desperate to get himself out of. Sound familiar? The first round of talks held 5 sessions through spring 2025. Then, in June 2025, before those talks could conclude, Israel launched a 12-day military campaign targeting Iran's nuclear and military infrastructure. Talks collapsed. They resumed in February of 2026. A second round of indirect negotiations in Geneva, Oman serving again as mediator. A UK security advisor who attended the talks later said negotiators had reached agreement on key issues. A deal, by multiple accounts, was within reach. On February 26, 2026, the talks ended with what mediators called significant progress. 2 days later, on February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury. Nearly 900 strikes in the first 12 hours. Targets: nuclear facilities, ballistic missile infrastructure, air defense systems, military production sites, senior leadership. Over the course of 40 days of sustained combat, the U.S. military approximately 13,000 strikes on Iranian military targets. Israel conducted over 10,800 strikes on more than 4,000 targets. Iran retaliated. Approximately 650 ballistic missiles were fired at Israel's population centers and U.S. military positions across the region. 20 Israeli civilians and foreign nationals were killed. More than 7,000 Israelis were injured. On April 8, 2026, a ceasefire took effect. And then, 6 days later, today, the United States began a naval blockade of Iranian ports along the Strait of Hormuz. Negotiations are ongoing. J.D. Vance spent the last weekend in Islamabad attempting to broker an agreement. The talks failed. China has now entered the negotiations. Trump says Iran has reached out about a deal. The IAEA still has no access to Iran's key nuclear sites. Now here's what we know. The Guardian reported that the new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, who replaced his father following the war, has made no statement about whether the religious fatwa banning nuclear weapons set in place by his predecessor remains in place. Let that sit with you for a moment. Okay, now it's time to connect the dots. Sanctions. Iran has been under American sanctions for over 40 years. The program kept going. Cyber attacks? Stuxnet was the most sophisticated in history. It bought 2 years. Withdrawal from the deal? Iran accelerated enrichment. Assassination of the second most powerful figure in the country? Iran launched missiles at American bases and kept enriching. Negotiations that reached agreement on key issues? War begins 2 days later. 40 days of joint American and Israeli airstrikes on Iranian nuclear facilities? A blockade and ongoing talks. And Iran is not a small, isolated nation. It has a population of 85 million people, the second largest economy in the Middle East. Over 70 years of accumulated nuclear expertise. Scientists trained in American universities under Atoms for Peace, who trained other scientists who trained others. The knowledge doesn't leave. The pattern doesn't change, only the names do. So here's the question I'll leave you with. The United States helped Iran build its nuclear foundation in 1957. It backed the regime that modernized Iran's infrastructure for 2 decades. It watched Iran's neighbor use chemical weapons on Iranian civilians without consequence. It demonstrated in 1988 exactly what happens to countries without ultimate deterrence. It assassinated Iran's most important military commander. It launched the most sophisticated cyber attack in history. It withdrew from a working deal. And then it went to war. Today, there is a live blockade on Iran's coastline. Iran has had the knowledge and expertise to build nuclear weapons for almost 70 years. For almost 70 years. Iran has just been days away from making a bomb. They haven't, but it isn't because they can't. So what's stopping them? If this connected some dots, that's what this channel is for. Subscribe, because we're just getting started.